Saint Francis Xavier, Confessor. His tongue, the Spirit's two-edged sword, had magic in its blade, for while it smote with every word, it healed the wounds it made. Yet who so humbly walked as he, a conqueror in the field, wreathing the rose of victory around his radiant shield, bridges. Saint Francis Xavier, the Apostle of the Indies, and one of the companions of the great Saint Ignatius in founding the Venerable Society of Jesus, was born at the castle of his family, not far from Pamplona, in the year 1506. His lineage was noble, and his father was one of the chief counselors of the King of Navarre. His parents had a numerous family, and Francis was their youngest child. He was carefully instructed under private tutors, and gave early signs of intellectual quickness and of pious dispositions. His natural good humor made him a universal favorite with all who knew him, and great hopes were entertained of his future career. He manifested such remarkable talent that in the 18th year of his age, his father sent him to Paris, where he entered the College of St. Barbara and commenced the study of philosophy. He made rapid progress, and in 2 years he received the degree of Master of Arts. He then began to teach philosophy at Beauvais, residing still in the College of St. Barbara. While he was living thus, and was daily making new friends and building up his hopes of future greatness, he had the happiness to form a friendship with Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who was completing his studies in the same college. Francis had often rallied Saint Ignatius concerning the poverty of his apparel, and told him that he thought he would be serving God much more effectually by ceasing to appear so singular, and to be a scandal to nearly all who know him. Ignatius bore all his taunts with patience and good humor, and in return bantered him upon his worldliness, vanity, and ambition. And one day the repetition by Saint Ignatius of the words, "What will it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" opened his eyes to his danger, and wrought the conversion of one of the greatest saints in the calendar of the Church. Francis at once placed himself under the direction of the devout man whom he before affected to despise, and made every effort to root out his ruling passion, vainglory, from his heart. The earnestness with which he set to work was most edifying, and his fasts and other austerities astonished even the mortified Ignatius. During the college vacation in 1535, he performed the spiritual exercises under Saint Ignatius's direction, with extraordinary devotion and great profit. He resolved to forsake forever the glittering prospects which the world held out to him, and give himself to the work which Ignatius was then just preparing to inaugurate. On the feast of Our Lady's Assumption in the same year, Xavier was one of the devoted 6 who, with Saint Ignatius, bound themselves by vow in the church of Montmartre near Paris, either to go, as soon as their studies were completed, to the Holy Land to labor for the conversion of the infidels, or to devote themselves to any work which the sovereign pontiff should select. In November 1536, having finished their theological studies, the first 9 companions of Saint Ignatius, for they had been joined by 3 others in the course of the intervening year, started for Venice, where they had agreed to meet the founder of their company. They arrived at Venice in the following January, where they met Saint Ignatius, who divided them into 2 sections to serve in the hospitals of that city. Francis gave himself to this humble duty with all the ardor which he had formerly shown in his pursuit of worldly honors. He performed the most menial offices with a glad promptness, which made him an example to all his companions, and triumphed over the weakness of nature by devoting himself especially to the care of the patients afflicted with the most loathsome and disgusting diseases. In the summer of 1537, Saint Francis was ordained priest, and with his companions took the vows of poverty and chastity. Early in the next year, he accompanied Saint Ignatius to Rome to assist in the foundation of the Society of Jesus. As the Holy Land was disturbed by war, the design of going thither was abandoned, and the members of the new order awaited the commands of the Supreme Pontiff. In the interval, Xavier was placed at the Church of St. Lorenzo in Damaso to preach to the poor. His zeal soon made its mark on the population of that quarter, and multitudes began to throng his confessional, when, by a singular dispensation of Providence, he was selected in the place of Father Bobadilla, who was ill, to go to Lisbon to join Father Rodriguez, and sail from thence for the East Indies, to plant the faith of Christ in those remote countries. St. Francis stopped some months in Lisbon until all the arrangements for his voyage could be completed, and occupied himself in tending the sick and visiting the poor. The Pope appointed Xavier his apostolic nuncio in the East, with full authority to act for him. The King of Portugal took a deep interest in the enterprise, and wished to send the missionaries out in a regal manner, but the saint would not consent to receive from him even the simplest necessaries of life. In April 1541, St. Francis sailed with 2 companions in the ship of the Portuguese admiral, for the land and the work with which his name was to be ever after associated. The voyage was long and tiresome, but Xavier lost no moment during its slowly creeping hours, for he looked on the whole ship's company as being his particular spiritual charge. They stopped at Mozambique and other places, so that 13 months passed away before they found themselves at the end of their voyage. They landed at Goa, in India, in May 1542, and proceeded immediately to the residence of the bishop of that see, to whom St. Francis presented his credentials and said that he should not use his authority without his approbation. The zealous prelate embraced the saint and promised to support him in all his measures for the advancement of the great work he had undertaken. The Portuguese inhabitants of Goa were at that time living almost universally in neglect of their religious duties, and were a scandal even in the eyes of the infidels. Xavier went among them, and his ardent zeal and winning charity soon turned the tide of irreligion and immorality which was overwhelming them. In 6 months their reformation was effected, and the saint, having acquired some knowledge of the Malabar language, went to Cape Comorin, some 600 miles distant from Goa, which was inhabited by a people, most of whom had been baptized by the Portuguese, but who were Christians only in name. To the instruction and reformation of these degraded people, the saint devoted himself with wondrous success, and then returned to Goa to obtain assistance for a field of labor, which seemed to grow larger at every step he advanced into it. On his return he journeyed inland to Travancore, where the gift of tongues was miraculously conferred on him, and he began to instruct the people in their native language. He sometimes preached to thousands of people in the open air, and soon established a Christian community in the very center of heathenism. He did not hesitate to confront the Brahmins and expose their errors and corruption with a boldness that made the people regard him with awe. On one occasion, when his work seemed to be productive of no good fruit, he performed several miracles. Among them was the raising of a dead man to life, and these had such an effect on those who witnessed them, that in a few months nearly the whole population was converted to the Christian faith. The limits of this sketch will not allow us to follow the Apostle of the Indies in all the particulars of his glorious career. It is enough to say that he visited many places in India, and wherever he went, reformed those among the Christians who had forgotten their religious duties, and converted thousands of pagans who had never before heard the name of their Redeemer. In 1549 he went to Japan, where he sowed the first seed of Christianity, a seed which grew so wonderfully that in a few years the Christian population of Japan was numbered by hundreds of thousands. The saint remained there more than 2 years, and then returned to India and sent a body of zealous missionaries to carry on the work which he had so successfully inaugurated. The all-embracing zeal of Xavier then prompted him to turn his eyes towards that vast empire which then, as until lately, closed its ports against all efforts to Christianize its immense population. He saw the missions he had established in India flourishing under the care of the missionaries of his order, and he yearned to plant the faith in China. To desire, to resolve, and to execute were, with this great apostle, one and the same thing, wherever the work of his master was concerned, and he sailed for China. After passing through great dangers by sea, he arrived at Sanxian, a barren island near Macau, on the coast of China. The government of China had threatened with death any European who should land on its shores, and the Christians who lived at Sanxian implored the saint not to proceed further in an enterprise which would be certain death if persisted in. Their pleas of worldly prudence were entirely lost on the zealous apostle. He saw the field of labor before him, hundreds of millions of human beings for whom Christ died, sunk in paganism, living and dying in ignorance of their redemption, and he gave no thought to the dangers which stood in the way of the accomplishment of his great designs. He waited patiently for an opportunity, and at last he found one. He made an agreement with a captain of a vessel, who promised to land him on the coast of China. Though enfeebled in health, Xavier went on board the ship, but the God whom he had served so faithfully was pleased to accept this expression of his will to extend the glory of his name, instead of demanding the deed. He grew worse so rapidly that the captain was obliged to put him on shore again, and there, on that bleak, inhospitable coast, under a poor hut, which imperfectly protected him from the winds, Xavier, tended by a faithful Portuguese, lay for several days racked with the piercing pains of a pleurisy fever. His glorious prospects, the hopes which had cheered his youth, and of which he used to talk to St. Ignatius at the college in Paris, had not, in his young imagination, it is true, such a termination as that. But what more could the heart, which had been quickened by divine grace, desire? He was a martyr in will, and his last efforts had been expended in the cause of God. He had labored for years to imitate his crucified Master. Could he ever have hoped to imitate him more closely than in the poverty and loneliness and severe bodily pain of that last hour? But in spite of his destitution, in spite of all his sufferings, the joys of heaven lighted up his deathbed with glory. Enraptured by the vision of the Savior whom he had loved and served so well, he breathed out his soul in an aspiration of divine love on the 2nd of December, 1552, when he was 46 years old. His remains were carried to Goa and were found to be incorrupt on their arrival, notwithstanding the quicklime which had been placed around them to consume the flesh. The right hand of the saint, which baptized so many thousands, is now preserved in a golden reliquary over the altar which is dedicated to his honor, in the sumptuous church of his order in Rome. His relics have been honored with many miracles, which, like those that he performed during his life, are attested by Protestant and pagan as well as Catholic witnesses. He was beatified by Pope Paul V in 1554, and canonized by Pope Gregory XV in 1662.